While utilitarianism is clearly a popular moral theory and has many advantages, it is not without its problems. Some problems are internal problems. There are things that have to be done with utilitarianism in order to address particular problems in its formulation. There are also external problems that are typically aimed at attacking utilitarianism itself. To use an analogy, you could think of a organization addressing various internal problems, and the goal is not to destroy the organization, but to address challenges within. And external problems would be like external attacks aimed at destroying it. Now, one challenge that all utilitarians face is this. If you ask all utilitarians, hey, do you aim at maximizing value for the morally relevant beings? They'll all say, sure, that's what we do. We're utilitarians. Now, the challenge here, though, is how do you formulate what this means? What is it to maximize value for the morally relevant beings? One possibility is that you should create maximum value for existing morally relevant beings. Or does it mean perhaps more of them should be created? Like you should make more people, thus having, say, more people that have more happiness. There's also the problem of how do you maximize this value in terms of, the total? Are you trying to just have maximize like the number, imagine happiness is like a number, maximize that number? Or are you trying to do it on average or per individual? And at this point, you might suspect this is analogous to distributing, say, wealth in an economy. If we talk about maximizing the economy, are we looking at maximizing, say, the total wealth in a country? Or are we looking at maximizing the average? That is, you take all the people added up, divided by the number of people. Are we trying to do that? Or are we looking at maximizing per individual? In other words, so each person would have, say, the most. And these can lead to be very different distributions. So if the only concern is, say, maximizing, say, sticking with the wealth analogy, the total wealth, it could mean having a tiny number of super rich people and most people being very poor. If you're looking at more of, distributing it on an average, you could have the same amount of, say, total wealth, but it could be spread out among the people. Or are you looking at other divisions? So the same sort of challenge exists for the utilitarian. So in place of like the money, they would have their thing of value, typically happiness. So you don't want to have like max happiness, which could involve having a very few very, very happy people. Or do you want to have, say, a good distribution of happiness? And so they have to address that problem. How are they going to distribute the happiness? Now, there's also the practical challenge of how do you measure value and compare it between individuals? So how would you do happiness and sort of sort that out for everybody? Now, these are, again, primarily challenges for utilitarians to fix. It's not like they're intended primarily to destroy the theory. They're just questions that need to be addressed. And different forms of utilitarianism solve or address those problems in different ways. Second problem, the problem of consequences. Now, consequences can extend indefinitely. And this would seem to make moral assessment impossible, except for someone who is omniscient, who knows everything. Now, this makes moral assessment rather problematic because an action that initially seems right or wrong could end up having really, terrible or great consequences. For example, use kind of a, silly example, but also kind of horrible. Imagine you're, walking along, by an apartment building, and you notice it's on fire, and someone in the upper story yells, "Catch my baby," and they throw the baby down to you. Now, suppose you catch the baby. and save the baby. This would seem to be good. But suppose the baby grows up to be the next Hitler and brings about, terrible, terrible, suffering on the part of people of the world. And that would seem to be, well, you did the wrong thing. But then suppose that this terrible person's great-granddaughter turns out to be an amazing person and solves many of the problems of humanity and leads humanity into a 1,000-year golden age. But then imagine that her, great grandson is worse than all previous tyrants combined and plunges humanity into 1,000,000 years of suffering. But then, the next person, after this 1,000,000 years, a descendant of that original person you saved leads humanity into a period of incredible enlightenment that lasts 10 million years. And then you just keep doing this forever. And so it seemed to be impossible to know what should you do, because the baby falling out of the window, yeah, that could be the next Hitler, and their great granddaughter to the millionth could be an incredible tyrant or incredible savior. So what do you do? Now again, that's kind of a silly case, but it nicely illustrates in its silly horribleness the problem of deciding whether an action is good or bad. Because if you have to trace the consequences for seemingly ever, then you could, unless you're omniscient, you can never make moral choices. Now, as you might imagine, utilitarians have found a way to fix this problem, essentially to try to solve the problem. Okay, how do you assess consequences? Practical problem. And this fellow C.I. Lewis, not to be confused with C.S. Lewis, who's the Narnia guy, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So C.I. Lewis argued that consequences can be split into 3 types. The first is the actual consequences. So you would say that an action is sort of absolutely right if it produces the best maximization of value. So if you were omniscient, you would know, the absolute right thing to do, because you would know that it would create among all possibilities the greatest happiness. Now, this, of course, brings in problems of like, what if time is infinite, etc. But at that point, you really can't argue against a moral theory by saying, infinite time, how do you handle that? Although, maybe you could. Secondly, there are what are called the reasonably foreseeable consequences. The idea being that, normally what would occur given our, usual experiences. And Mill addressed this problem as well, saying like how we set out to see, like, not just blindly, but we have our maps and charts, and we can get things wrong, but in general we know, for example, if you're walking by an apartment and it's on fire and someone, throws their child to you, the child is probably going to grow up to be an average person, and their descendants are probably going to be average people. Probably no Hitlers, no saviors, among them. And also there's a thing about, once it gets diluted out millions of years, can you really be said to be responsible? So typically, if a baby is being tossed to you, the right thing to do is catch the baby. Although you have no way of knowing in the absolute, limits of time what would be the consequences. Thirdly, Lewis talks about intended consequences. So from the subjective standpoint, this is a matter of motivations. Did you sincerely intend to maximize, value, to do the right thing? And if you did, you could say, yeah, it's subjectively right. So to use again, kind of a horrible example, in the sense that it's something bad happens, imagine this real case. Doctor has some medication, seems fine, it's labeled and sealed properly. They give the patient the medication, and they develop a spinal infection because the medicine was contaminated before, during the creation process. And so we wouldn't, even though that has terrible consequences, people getting this infection, we would say that the doctor, acted subjectively right, because their intent was to help the patient, and they had no way of knowing that the sealed, medicine had been contaminated in production.